special event in our series of Politics and Eggs with the New England Council. Just a couple of housekeeping things. The first thing is that our two esteemed guests, they named their book after exactly what all the faculty said to me when I returned in the paper. So I appreciate that, but I think they have the rights. So our sponsors here, obviously we wouldn't be able to do these breakfasts without our sponsors. And today, of course, even though it's lunch, we have eggs to keep up the tradition. We have a whole series of events at the Institute of Politics taking place, including grand state debates from the WNUR, which will take place in this room. We have two debates just this week with congressional candidates with the New Hampshire Journal. We have, with our partner, the New England Council, we have Mike Pence here for Politics and Eggs on August 17th. So check your calendars. And then actually, to be honest with you, we can't leak any more, but we have a lot more things already booked that you'll be hearing about that are very significant, much more significant than even Mr. Duper.
I'm just saying something.
Right. I will say that my good friends Terry Shoemaker, Ambassador Shoemaker, and Steve Dupree, they were very instrumental in not only making sure that our guests came today, but also that we have a very good lineup of candidates and people coming as speakers. They are outstanding friends of this institute, and we really appreciate their help. A couple of other things. Today we're going to have a little bit different format. We're going to have Jim Brett do a conversation, and so we're looking forward to that. So without further ado, Jim.
Did you stay up all night for that introduction? Wow. Really worked hard on that. Okay, wow. There are an awful lot of distinguished guests here today. You all know who you are. So, with that, welcome, and I want to thank our good friend, Neil Levesque, of the Institute, who does a fabulous job day in and day out here. And we're so proud, the New England Council, to have a relationship with the IOP here, but more importantly, the relationship we have with Neil is just, it's extraordinary. We work very well together. We get some great speakers, and all of you benefit from that. As he indicated, we have so many events coming up. Again, August 17th, former Vice President of the United States will be here. We in the New England Council have a couple of other events coming up that if you're a member of the New England Council, you may want to participate. Tomorrow we'll be heading north, really this afternoon, heading north to Burlington, Vermont. We'll have Congressman Peter Welch, who'll be speaking to the New England Council tomorrow morning. September, we have a couple of events planned. We have Congressman Jake Auchincloss will be speaking in Boston, and then we also have some events in Washington later that month with Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut and Congressman Stephen Lynch of Boston. And we hope that many of you will participate and be part of the events. But today we're honored to welcome two of the nation's most well-respected political journalists, Jonathan Martin and Alex Burns. Both are extraordinary reporters. I myself, if I see their byline, it's a must-read because you're going to learn something. It's extraordinary, the resources and the contacts and all of the sources that they have is just remarkable. But they are two really extraordinary political reporters. But one of the reasons why we are here today is because they also found time to be co-authors of the recent New York Times bestseller, This Will Not Pass, the definitive account of the 2020 election in the first year of the Biden presidency. Peggy Noonan, another person that I admire, wrote in the Wall Street Journal, quote, "When future historians chronicle this time of crisis, they'll turn to this book as a deeply valuable account of all human leaders," end of quote. I've read the book as soon as it came out in May, and let me tell you, I could not put it down. If you haven't read it yet, there's still time to add it to your summer reading list. I highly recommend it. We have some books over here on the right. Needless to say, we were very fortunate, the New England Council, back in May, to have Jonathan Martin and Alex Mern speak to all of our New England Council members in Washington. And needless to say, they were a hit, to say the least. They were outstanding. Our members said, is there any way you could ever bring them back, to New England and maybe up here to New Hampshire, maybe politics and eggs? And sure enough, because of the good support of, the ambassador and the major landlord here of this great state, Steve Dupree, they were able to convince them to be here today. So with that, if I'd ask Alex and Jonathan, please join us. Okay. All right. We got enough plugs on the book, okay? Well, welcome to Politics and Eggs, okay?
Thank you. What a thrill to be here. Appreciate it.
Before we get into some of the points in your book, how about talking about last night?
Yeah.
Michigan, Missouri, Arizona, your insight and what you take away from it.
Well, first of all, thanks for having us. It's a real treat to be back at IOP and at St. A's. And my wife, Betsy Fisher-Martin, is here, who's covered primaries here since before I became a journalist. And
wow.
I'm not going to say anything more than that.
Wow.
But she exactly. You have no idea. She pointed out.
It's only uphill now.
She pointed out on the way in that it was nice to see the campus covered in green instead of white, because we're so used to covering the primary debates here that have taken place a few hundred feet away. Most recently, where Chris Christie had his way with Marco Rubio, a night that we won't soon forget, I don't think, here on the campus. So thank you for having us, and thanks to so many friends in the audience who I've known for a lot of years. I think two things from last night. One, obviously, in Kansas, and the results were so emphatic that it really illustrates that post-Roe, there's real energy with abortion rights supporters. I wasn't terribly surprised that the ballot measure failed. What surprised me was the margin. I sort of thought going in it was probably going to be a 2 to 3 point margin. It turned out to be closer to 20, which tells you quite a bit. In a sleepy primary in August with no real action, by the way, on the rest of the ticket. It's not like there was a really high-profile Gov or Senate primary in Kansas like there was last night, Arizona, for example, or Missouri. That was striking. And I think the other issue that it's sort of endlessly fascinated by that we saw again last night is the former president's capacity to propel candidates or torpedo candidates. Obviously, in Arizona, he's able to get a former local TV anchor the nomination for governor over somebody who was sort of the pick of the mainstream of the party, including the sitting governor and the chairman of the RGA, Doug Ducey. And I was at the same time the president able to effectively end the career of Peter Meyer in Western Michigan, who lost his House primary to a Trump-backed candidate, becoming the latest of the 10 House Republicans who impeached President Trump to either retire or lose his primary. I'll defer to Alex with a fast plug. For this book right here, we have a scene in the book from February of 2021, just weeks after the second impeachment vote in the House, at which there was a caucus meeting held in the House GOP to determine the fate of Liz Cheney. And if you remember, she survived that first vote, that first test vote. And during the course of that night, Peter Meyer got up and said, by way of defending Liz Cheney, like, she shouldn't pay the biggest price politically for impeachment. And if we do that, we're in a dark place. And just as an aside, he said, I probably won't be here 2 years from now because of the vote that he cast. And how prophetic he was that night, and obviously now his career has, at least for now, ended. Alex, you want to jump in from last night?
Well, I'll just add my thanks to our great hosts and audience. It's a delight to be back after a long time away. Look, I'm going to borrow my observation here from Jonathan's last article, but I do think that the picture, particularly in Arizona, is so bracing for Republicans who have wanted to sort of bring the party back to not even the political center, but just a more conventional version of conservatism. That I'm not a sort of deep historian of Arizona politics, but it's certainly the most extreme right ticket for statewide office fielded in that state this century, and I suspect in my lifetime. And that's going to be a real test of the party and of Democrats as well, given the overall downswing the party's experiencing this year. It's a purple state at this point. I think we can say that pretty definitively. But and Republicans have nominated a ticket that is, by no recent historical standard within the sort of broad center of Arizona politics. But can Democrats overcome what Biden represents on the ballot and just sort of the overall economic environment to really show that they can compete in Arizona in a situation where Donald Trump is not necessarily the main issue in the election? And broadening that out, it's sort of an exclamation point on a sequence of primary elections where Republican primary voters have chosen particularly candidates for governor who are just very, very, very far to the right of what would be considered the GOP mainstream in recent memory. I think when there was a primary in Pennsylvania and one of the sort of big January 6th style election deniers in the state was nominated for governor, there was a question about, are Republicans blowing it in Pennsylvania, right? And that seemed like it'd be a pretty big deal because Pennsylvania is a pretty important state. But now you've seen it happen not just in Pennsylvania, but in a string of other states, sometimes with the help of Democrats spending in the Republican primary, but usually not, and not in Arizona. And the stakes to me, look, I think this is true of both me and Jonathan. Gov races are so important, and they don't get the attention usually that they deserve from the national media. And the notion of whether a sort of election denier or a really far out candidate wins a House race to become like the latest backbencher saying wild stuff in the House seems so much less significant in the lives of voters and in the civic life of the country than whether people who say and do these things end up actually in a position of great executive power.
Another casualty in Arizona was the Speaker of the House, Rusty Bowers. He ran for the state senate. He lost 2-1.
Yeah. He's I think most of you probably saw his testimony at the 1-6 committee. Perhaps saw him on TV with John Carl last Sunday. He's a great Arizona character. I had some time with him when I was there doing a story earlier this year. And he's actually a sort of part-time artist, has a great Western art set up, and sort of classic McCain style, Steve, sort of straight shooting Arizonan. But look, he was on the wrong side of what is effectively the bright line today in internal Republican politics. And Bowers to me is the latest example of what has become effectively the sort of axiom of post-Trump presidency politics, which is if you are willing to go to ground or simply turn the other cheek, you can fend off a Trump-backed primary. Brian Kemp in Georgia is the most obvious example of that. The two Washingtonians who are going to get through to the general election, Dan Newhouse and Jamie Herrera Butler, are obviously lower profile examples of that last night. And then I would throw in David Valadao, who's the third of the 10 impeachers, who also is going to make it to the general election. If you're willing to effectively sort of muzzle yourself about Trump and impeachment in 1-6, you can survive. But if you talk about it publicly in ways that sort of give no quarter, Peter Meyer, Rusty Bowers, Tom Rice, Adam Kinzinger, Anthony Gonzalez are retiring, but obviously you can include them, and potentially now Liz Cheney, then you're going to have a hard time surviving. So that's really the choice for Republicans with Trump now is, you can survive him if you're willing to sort of turn the other cheek. It's hard to survive the threat if you openly combat his challenge.
Now you have Congressman Meyer. He takes the profile and courage vote, 1 of 10, to impeach the president. And the Democrats put in $500,000 to his opponent, who's an election denier, who may win. What does that say? I myself, I'm not healthy with that idea that we go after people who take that tough vote and say, wait a minute, we're going to work behind the scenes and get the far-right candidate and defeat him and think that we might be able to defeat the far-right in November. You may not. But is this something that we're just going to expect more and more? I know we've seen it before with, McCaskill, and she did it, but are we going to see this now? This is going to be something that's going to be routine, doing this?
I think we should assume that it will be. And I do think it speaks to the perception, certainly in both parties, that the stakes here are existential, and also the perception in both parties that there's really not any particular value in having people. And I don't mean to paint with too broad a brush here, but that I think it's generally fair to say that in the sort of campaign class of both parties, there's no particular sense of needing to defer to people on the other side who are more pragmatic or more willing to work across the aisle. At the end of the day, you're still wearing the wrong party label next to your name, and you're still going to vote for the person who is seen as the wrong candidate for speaker or the wrong person to lead the Senate in organizing a resolution. And so at the end of the day, that's really all that matters. And it's something that we have in the book over and over, and it's one of the things that I'd be very curious what President Biden would say behind closed doors or in a polygraph about what he thinks of what the DCCC did in Michigan, right? Because his whole brand of politics and his whole theory, at least at the start of how you were supposed to approach the presidency, is you find the people on the other side who you can do business with, and then you give them the room to do business with you, right? And that's obviously not the sort of standard practice of most anybody else in his party or the other party at this point. I think that the Meyer example is particularly challenging for Democrats because it wasn't just the impeachment vote, right? That his votes on infrastructure, his votes on the gun compromise, right? That this is somebody who looks like a person who you could do business with for quite some time. But it's not like he's out there saying he's not going to vote for Kevin McCarthy for Speaker if he's reelected. And I do think that, the other side of this, and this is not to shift the spotlight away from the Democrats, but I do think that, look, it's not like the Republican cavalry rode in to save Peter Meyer either, right? That it was a profile and courage vote, and it was a profile and courage vote because, you pay a price for it, and he sure did.
Right.
Yeah, I was curious where, to Alex's point, where the Republicans were. I mean, the DeVos family is the most obvious example. Sort of, they effectively run the Michigan Republican Party. Very, very wealthy family. Betsy DeVos memorably broke with President Trump and resigned from her cabinet post after January 6th. Why wouldn't they have made an example of that race and tried to sort of protect Peter Meyer, who their family goes back generations with his family? I'm sort of struck by the lack of sort of investment from people in the GOP who want to make a point of their own.
Now, you wrote in the New York Times yesterday there might be a silver lining for Democrats running for governor. Can you just expand on that?
Sure. Alex mentioned this a bit earlier. Gov races never get the attention that the congressional races do, especially the Senate races. But look, they're extremely important this year because of both the Supreme Court's recent decisions, but also because of the role that these governors play in a lot of states. In presidential elections and in the Electoral College. In a handful of states, the Republican Party has nominated figures who are either almost virtually certain to lose or are just going to have a steeper climb. Some of them because President Trump pushed them through in the primary, other cases because President Trump effectively weighed in. Next door, for example, in Massachusetts, saying, he was going to sort of wage a primary against Charlie Baker if Baker sought a third term, and Baker said, no thanks, I don't want to deal with that hassle. I've had a good run, and so he decides not to run again, which effectively is turning over the keys to Maura Healey. In Maryland, Trump wants his pound of flesh from Larry Hogan, has been a critic of his, and so he does that by getting behind a state legislator who's an outspoken Hogan opponent and an avid election denier. That person gets the nomination. And I think most importantly in Pennsylvania, where Doug Mastriano has gotten the nomination and is now facing like a $20 million fundraising deficit against Josh Shapiro, the state attorney general, extremely significant. And I'm really fascinated to see if the Republican governors even try to bail out Mastriano there, or if they just write that off. But even candidates who are viable, you look at Michigan, for example. Gretchen Whitmer has got a $20 million stockpile. She's a very formidable incumbent. And the Republicans, because they get shut out in 2018, terrible year, have no bench effectively left in statewide office. And so there's no sort of John Engler, if you will, waiting in the wings there. And it's not clear who's going to emerge, and they were worried that there was going to be a far-right Mastriano type figure who emerged. That didn't happen, but they nominated a former conservative media personality, and Tudor Dixon, who could win, but who is totally untested. And it just sort of is a really clear example of the kind of people making it through these primaries this year for Republicans, who oftentimes have not run for office before, and typically don't have the kind of grounding in the state that helps to win these tough gov races that are much more referendums on the individual candidates than congressional races, which much more tend to be you're registering your content or discontent on the national state of affairs. So I think last night with Arizona and Michigan nominating Kerry Lake and Tudor Dixon, neither of which has been on the ballot before, are going to have significant fundraising deficits, at least at the outset. Total gambles, and could win in both cases, but it's going to take a lot more work than it probably otherwise could have been if they had seen more mainstream candidates nominated.
The only thing I'll add there, and to pander to the audience a little bit, and to your speaker.
That's allowed here in New Hampshire.
Your speaker, a previous speaker this week. I do think you have seen, at least at this point in primary season, a vindication of some of the skepticism that folks like Chris Sununu and Larry Hogan and Doug Ducey had about putting themselves on just the sort of total war primary ballot this year. They all had reasons besides that for not running, and I'm not saying they were all just sort of running from the fight. But the notion that in a state like Maryland, would Larry Hogan have ended up as the Republican Senate nominee? Yes, probably. He's a very, very popular figure there. But would he have had to go through a sort of meat grinder of a Republican primary with Donald Trump just abusing him every day and campaigning for a really far-out opponent who Hogan sees as just fathoms beneath him? Like, yeah, he would have. They all would have. And if they were all if they had all run, probably some of them would have been nominated, and probably Republicans would have a much better chance of taking the U.S. Senate. But I don't know that all of them would have been nominated, and somebody could have seen their career end in a really humiliating way.
We have a scene in the book late on the night of January 6th where Mitch McConnell, already looking ahead to the midterms, as is his wont to think about the next election, it's very McConnell on brand, basically vows to defeat all the Trumpian candidates in the midterms. Not only is Trump discredited by virtue of January 6th, but basically says we're going to make sure that he stays discredited and sort of loses his clout in the party by winning these proxy wars in 2022. Well, you can't help but notice that most of the Senate races in 2022, with one big exception last night, although there's a caveat on that, that didn't happen, right? Look at Ohio with J.D. Vance, all right? Look at Georgia with Herschel Walker, Arizona with Blake Masters, and then the states Alex mentioned where McConnell didn't get his candidates even to run in the first place. So New Hampshire, Hogan in Maryland, Ducey in Arizona. And so, Trump has effectively had his way in a lot of these primaries. Missouri obviously is a more complicated question because Trump obviously wanted to put his stamp on the race and wanted to have his candidate win, but Trump so cares about his win-loss record that he didn't want to gamble on Greitens, which would have been the much better poke in the eye against McConnell, because he didn't want to be a loser if Greitens lost. And so instead he decides to effectively As Roy Blunt put it, you can't lose when you bet on all the horses. Put a wager on the two front runners, or I should say two of the top candidates in that race. But now you've got McConnell, who still could take back control of the majority. I think that's certainly a viable possibility with 97 days out or whatever we are here, just given how many seats are up for grabs. But what kind of majority will that be for Mitch McConnell? He's going to have people like Blake Masters and J.D. Vance potentially joining with the Josh Hawleys of the world, who have views, especially on national security, that are antithetical to what he thinks. And he's going to have folks like Herschel Walker and Dr. Oz, maybe in Pennsylvania, who just create a host of other issues, shall we say, for him. So it's hard to look at these primaries and not see Trumpism still not only viable, but flourishing in a lot of places.
I was going to make that point that if Mitch McConnell is the majority leader, it may not be an easy time for him. I know that's what he wants, is be majority leader, but he's losing such good friends. The Portmans, the Toomeys, the Burrs, and Blunt. Those are his pals. And as you said, they could be replaced by the JDs and the Dr. Oz. So it's not going to be easy for him if he is able to capture the majority.
We actually asked McConnell about that when we talked to him for the book. And I think he said, he didn't say these words directly, but he retains a level of confidence that he can sort of housebreak, if you will, a lot of these characters coming to the Senate. Is that fair to say, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge for him, and one of the challenges for him, and we have a reference to this towards the end of the book, is the expectation among his colleagues that he's not going to be around as leader for all that much longer, right? There's a scene towards the end of the book where John Thune, his deputy, is thinking of not running for re-election, and McConnell just sort of, without saying it exactly, just says, listen, I'm not going to be in this job forever. The implication being, someday, son, all this could be yours, right? And the challenge in terms of bringing, if he does end up as the majority leader again, but with a majority that's built on Senator Oz MD, let's say, is that, yeah, maybe you can housebreak these guys, but if they think you're not going to be in charge in another 2 years, how much leverage do you really have to put them in their place, right? And if they see you as really a guy with like 1.5 feet out the door, and they see Donald Trump as the guy who brought you there in the first place, well, who's your boss really going to be?
And while we're on the topic of the Senate, I mean, boy, do individual races matter so much when you've got a 50-50 Senate. You think about Pennsylvania, where a few hundred votes separate, a reality show TV doctor from one of the country's wealthiest people who could have effectively self-financed his whole campaign and saved the NRSC tens of millions of dollars and probably been a pretty strong candidate, David McCormick. Instead now, Republicans are playing defense in that state. And then, obviously the choice of the governor here. You think about what that would have meant to Senate Republicans if they had had a popular brand name governor running against a freshman senator in this state. I wouldn't say that you begin the cycle +1, but pretty close to it, maybe. That's those small things could make a really important difference here in November if the Senate majority is on a knife's edge.
Talking about your book, This Will Not Pass, what does that mean? That the environment does not change? Or?
Well, I mean, I think that there was this sort of running conversation through the Trump presidency about whether, the country's political culture was so toxic because of Donald Trump, and what you needed to do was get a new president, and then things would return to some semblance of normalcy, or whether Trump was more of a symptom of an underlying sort of social problem with our political culture and with our institutions of government, and that even if you were to defeat Trump in 2020, or if he were to announce that he's going to go you know, take up gardening and be gone from politics, you know, you'd still have some pretty massive cultural and structural problems in the political system. You know, one of the people who was a strong proponent of Theory 1, that you needed to beat Trump and then life would return to a semblance of normalcy, was Joe Biden. And you know, he said over and over, after the day after the election, Republicans will have an epiphany and we'll be able to work together again, and maybe it won't happen after 3 months, it may be 6 months, and every time the horizon got a little bit longer, and by Labor Day we'll all be working together again. And look, I think our view very consistently, and we have the email traffic to prove it, was that no, Trump is not the heart of what ails the country's political system and political culture, that he's certainly a huge contributor to the division in the country and the dysfunction in Washington, but that, you know, the defeat of Donald Trump would not mean that this moment of crisis was over, that this will not pass. We're still living in it.
Right.
The history is still unfolding in front of us. I will say, in fairness to President Biden, I think we are at a place right now where the theory of being able to work together again to a certain degree is looking a little bit healthier today than it did when we turned in the book, which was in February. You know, the fact that they didn't just get infrastructure, but they got chips, they got the gun bill, they could conceivably get you know, a law codifying gay marriage with a strong bipartisan support, certainly in the House, and that you could get the reconciliation deal done, not with bipartisan support, but certainly in a format that's more, you know, that's closer to the political center than its previous incarnation. It doesn't look like so far-fetched to say that the country's political system is a little bit healthier today than it was a year ago, but that's all happening over in this ring of the circus, right? And the other two rings of the circus look pretty damn crazy and not getting any less so.
No, the bad news, Mr. Shoemaker here in the audience, is that the title does not refer to the DNC resolution, torpedoing New Hampshire's first in the nation status. Which a topic I'm shocked has not come up yet in the first 20 minutes here.
That's my last question.
Okay, there we go.
That's my last question.
There we
is
go.
that with all your sources, obviously the DNC is deferred till after the election because, you know, we get some, the Democrats have some, you know, candidates running and they don't want this issue to be part of the campaign.
Yeah.
So your sources indicate that when it's all said and done after November, Iowa is gone as a caucus. The question is, does Nevada go first? Does Iowa, does South Carolina go first? Or does New Hampshire go first?
Well,
but do you see New Hampshire in the mix being one of the two
Yeah.
the first in the nation?
I think you have to separate Iowa from New Hampshire at this point.
Right.
I think, first of all, it's important to say that for the first time in decades, it does seem pretty clear that we're going to have separate calendars between the two parties, which we've not had in a long time. And because the Republicans are going to stick with Iowa and New Hampshire, 1 and 2, pretty clearly.
Wrath is nodding, so you obviously are right.
What?
Either that or he's sleeping. It's one or the other.
It hasn't been that bad, Tom. Come on. That will not pay. Yeah, nice. So I think, I think Iowa. I think Iowa is going to have a really difficult time retaining their status as first in the nation with Democrats. I think that's pretty clear. I think Michigan is making a very aggressive case to be one of the opening states and could potentially be the Midwestern state that takes the place of Iowa. I think New Hampshire is sort of less certainty. It's more complicated, right? Because you have a state law here mandating that New Hampshire be the first primary. That's a complication. The other complication is you've got 2 senators in the state who have a relationship with the President of the United States, one of which is on the ballot this year in a really important race that could decide control of the Senate. And the third complication is New Hampshire is a swing state in a way that Iowa is not anymore. New Hampshire remains competitive politically, and what Biden or whoever the Democratic nominee is in 24 needs the electoral votes of this state, all 27 of them, right? 27? I'm a little bit high, maybe. And I think so. Those factors make New Hampshire different. Now, that might not be enough to save New Hampshire's status with Democrats, but it obviously does give the state some grounds to argue on. I will say, the UNH poll, not to cite another institution of higher learning here at St. A's, but the UNH poll did get the attention of a lot of people in Democratic politics, where you're a sitting president and you're basically tied with your transportation secretary for first place in the primary that begins the process. It's hard to miss that. And that got a lot of attention, I think, and that I don't think was going to do many favors for New Hampshire's first in the nation status.
The only thing I'll just add on there, just to keep on pandering like a maniac here, and I promise you I'm not running for anything.
He's not ruling anything out, folks. Not ruling anything out.
You know, you guys have not committed like the kind of capital crimes that Iowa has organizationally over the last few years, right? Like how many times can you crash the car before you take away the keys? Or you guys have 0 points on the license by comparison. So look, I think it's very, very easy in Democratic politics to justify saying, like, Iowa doesn't represent the party, Iowa's not a swing state, the last Iowa caucus was a total fiasco, and the one before that was like not too hot either, right? It's harder to argue with the, the basic structure of the New Hampshire primary, although there's plenty to for national Democrats and Democrats in bigger, more diverse states to quibble with about the structure of the New Hampshire electorate. Like that's what you guys are up against, right? I think that it would be, for the reason Jonathan just cited, I think it'd be hard to take away any kind of special place for New Hampshire because of the role you play in a general election, because of the stature of your two senators, assuming you still have both of them in a couple months. And also because, yeah, I think that it could be, this is not traditionally friendly territory for a president who's facing a challenge from within his own party. And I do think that there would be, perhaps some people might interpret a decisive shift away from New Hampshire as a sign of a little bit of a distress signal for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's a state where independents can vote, I've been told, in either primary of their choice. And that's the kind of thing for Biden. If your approval among independents is sitting in the 30s or even the 20s, I'm not sure you want to have the primary start in a state where those kind of folks can vote, right? I think that alone is pretty ominous.
And did the poll of Donald Trump tied with the governor of Florida get any attention?
A little bit, yeah. Especially in certain South Florida resort towns. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Look, I think there is a sense among a lot of Republicans who would never vote for a never Trump type candidate. That it's time for somebody else. It's time to move on. And I really think that Ron DeSantis benefits from being the kind of vessel right now for a lot of those voters who know a little bit about him and kind of like his swagger and like what they've seen on Fox. But I don't think they're locked in. I think they're they're not in love with him. What's the old saying? Dated deed, married Carrie. I think they're interested. But I think right now he's just taking up a really solid vote share of conservative, sort of MAGA adjacent Republicans, if you will, who don't want Trump to run again and want an alternative, and he's the guy right now. I think if I was Trump, that would be the most ominous thing for me. He's not DeSantis himself, but just that there is somebody else taking up so many votes for not Trump right now.
Mm-hmm. Not to jump the gun, but if Donald Trump decides to run, does he face any competition?
For sure. I don't know that he faces Ron DeSantis as the
That's my question.
That's, for now at least, seems like a pretty urgent question. But, as Jonathan's saying, there's clearly a pool of voters who are very open to somebody who is conservative and kind of Trumpy, but not literally Trump, right? The thing that would concern me if I were a Republican who does not want Trump to be the nominee again is when you look at these primaries around the country and you see a Blake Masters who is a far less well-known, far less compelling as a personality than Donald Trump, winning against a fractured field with a vote share in the mid-30s. I don't really see any reason to think that Donald Trump himself couldn't do that against a field of candidates who are, probably less well-equipped than Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, I mean, Tom will know this, but what did Trump get here in 2016? What was the vote that he got? In the primary, yeah. Remember? No, you got more than that. Trump. 36, right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so there you go. I mean, that's a great example of that, right? And 35% in New Hampshire, good enough for a ticket to ride, right? So,
You know, you mentioned President Biden earlier. You know, I'm looking at his accomplishments in the, you know, the year and a half, raise a thin Senate, 50-50. The American Rescue, 1.9 trillion. The infrastructure, bipartisan, that he really preached so much on. Bipartisan, the CHIPS bill. He may get this lower prescription drug that so many people have asked for, so can put lower health care costs in his column. $380 billion could be coming on climate change that so many people thought was, you know, out of the run. Probably going to revise the U.S. tax code. If you read, you know, the articles, deficit might be reduced by $300 billion. Gun legislation, gun safety legislation, bipartisan. To me, something that's never been really promoted is Ukraine and keeping NATO together. Extraordinary, keep them all together. So all in all, for somebody who's got a 50-50 Senate, that's pretty significant in a year and a half of accomplishments. And yet, the president's numbers are below, you know, favorability is below 40 and 70%, wrong direction. And is the White House missing an opportunity to pat themselves on the back, to promote themselves, to say, hey, well done in a year and a half. Look what we've accomplished.
Sure. I mean, I think the short answer is yes, and I think that one of the things that we sort of get into towards the end of the book is the sort of consternation among Democrats that, you know, a number of the accomplishments you just listed had not yet been enacted. But, you know, the fact that rather than getting infrastructure through and then spending the fall of 21 taking a big victory lap on infrastructure, they created this tortured linkage with Build Back Better, spent months with Democrats arguing with each other about who in the Democratic Party is to blame for screwing everything up, then ultimately pass it only because they got whooped in Virginia, and then, you know, by then inflation is the main thing on every voter's mind. Just a giant missed opportunity, right? I think the American Rescue Plan, I did a story about this a couple months ago, right? I think the American Rescue Plan is one of these things that if Democrats were determined about communicating on it, could pay dividends for them for years and years because of the kind of money that's getting spent all over the country in ways that voters have no conception that it's coming from the federal government right now. But the president's done very, very little to explain that to the country. And so it's just this sort of $2 trillion stand-in for dealing with COVID, which is still not totally over, right? And it's seen as this irritant on inflation, right? Which again is now the main political issue. I think one of the biggest what-ifs, one of the dynamics that we track in the book for Biden is his inability or refusal to choose between which version of the Biden presidency does he really want to have? Does he want to be the candidate he was when he entered the presidential race in April of 2019, to sort of bring the country back together, heal the nation, cut bipartisan deals, and just kind of make things work again? Or does he want to be the candidate he tried to become after the end of the Democratic primary when, rather than running to the middle, he ran to the left and said, we are going to transform this country and heal it in a sort of a more profound and comprehensive way. And we're not just going to sort of tinker around the edges of policy. We're going to make, to borrow a Massachusetts phrase, a big structural change. And so his inability to choose between those two tracks was just the heart of so much of his political dysfunction, the dysfunction of the Democratic Party. And I think one of the big what-ifs of the Biden presidency is, what if he had stuck to the first one? The version that clearly is the more authentic Joe Biden, and the version of Joe Biden and Bidenism that actually lines up much better with the governing record that you just laid out. That if he had come in saying, we're going to do compromise whenever we can, and we're going to do, on a party line basis, stuff that is just overwhelmingly urgent where we can't afford to wait on the other side. So climate change, COVID vaccine funding, that kind of stuff. Yeah, we'll go it alone on that stuff. Everything else we're going to seek compromise. I don't know whether the results in terms of policy would be all that different or better, but I do think the country would have a clearer sense like who this guy is and what he's about. And right now, I think that's so much of his political problem, that his personality and his record, there's nobody weaving them together in a story that the average voter understands.
He ironically, one of the few issues where he would publicly criticize Obama, even though in private he has plenty of criticism for Obama, but in public was Obama's inability to, or lack of desire to go out and sell his accomplishments and be an aggressive sort of barnstorming type politician. And Biden vowed he wouldn't make the same mistake, and he sure did. And it's almost become a joke along the lines of Infrastructure Week was in the Trump years, that we're forever hearing these stories. Well, Biden's about to go out there and spend a lot of time on the road, and he's going to sell this thing. He's sort of Biden's hitting the road. We keep hearing that, but he doesn't keep the schedule like that is sort of promised. And we have a scene at the end of the book where Biden in the fall did get on the road. He was in Michigan in October at a labor facility, and he's speaking to a local congressman there, Democrat named Dan Kildee, and Kildee kind of takes him aside and says, it makes a difference when you get out there. And Biden assures him, yeah, I'm going to. It's now August, that's October, and Biden just simply has not been the public presence that I think he wanted to be. I think part of that obviously is COVID, as Alex alluded to, which Biden has now experienced personally. But I think part of it is the fact that his office is skeptical about what he can do, and fears that if he's out there too much, that either A, he'll be exposed to COVID, here we go, or B, he'll commit gaffes. Biden's done far less interviews than any modern president, and he does not keep the kind of schedule that other modern presidents have. And I think that has been a factor in terms of the sort of lack of public definition that Alex was talking about. He did not get west of Central Time until Labor Day of his first year in office. The first time he went west of Central Time was right after Labor Day, when he went to California for Gavin Newsom's recall. And he only did it because Newsom personally requested help from the White House to ensure his victory in that recall. A fact the White House has not forgotten, by the way, as Gavin Newsom now makes a lot of noises about Democrats and the future of the party. But I think it's just one small fact that gets at sort of Biden's limited schedule.
I mean, you talk in your book about how the president struggled with his style of governing. You talk, was he going to be an FDR? Was he going to be an LBJ? He brings in, the Doris Kearns Goodwins of the world to talk to him that this could be the chance to be bold and, a daring agenda. And reading your book, I got the impression he was heavy into that, because in the back of his mind, he wanted to show his predecessor, I think, big and bold, outside the box, and I can deliver.
And not just his immediate predecessor, the President Obama.
Obama.
No, I think that's clearly the case. This meeting with historians that you're referring to after the American Rescue Plan passes, where Biden sort of keeps on asking them versions of the question, how big can we go? And I think it does get to the heart of, look, we can talk about the sort of high-minded debates in the Democratic Party and the disagreements over policy and how big they should go, but there's a level of this that is ego, right? In the sense that I've been waiting my whole life to be president. Now I got to make this count, particularly given that it's not clear how much time he has in the job, right? I don't mean that in a sort of morbid way, but that Biden is certainly planning to run for re-election. Anybody who tells you otherwise is lying. But he is sensitive to the fact that that's not totally within his own control, right? That he's sensitive to his age and sort of what life might throw his way. Look, I think that
But didn't anyone at that table say, Mr. President, you have a 5-vote majority in the House, and at the time, you also had 48 votes in the Senate.
Not that our reporting turned up, but it is sort of, I think for Democrats in Congress, there was something galling about the fact that that was where he was early in 2021. And by the time he actually goes up to the Hill for the first time, Speaker Pelosi thinks it is the end of September, very end of September, when Speaker Pelosi thinks he's going up to tell the House Democrats, you got to stop stalling on infrastructure, you got to just pass the damn bill. He obviously doesn't do that the first time or the second time. But he goes in the room and kind of rambles about how, to do New Deal style stuff, to do LBJ scale legislation, those guys had margins that I don't have. That was true the entire year. He had that information the entire time, right? So for him to have gone out there and raised the expectations and hopes of so much of his party, not just in Washington, but obviously the voting base of the Democratic Party, that we're going to create this cradle-to-grave social care system that has never existed in American history, and we're going to deal with climate change too, and we're going to do immigration, and we're going to do police reform. And then you come to them in September and say, like, upon further consideration, it's a 50-50 Senate, right? That was pretty galling to the rank and file.
Didn't you have a member of the Democratic Party in Virginia say, Mr. President, we want you to be, we don't want you to be FDR, just to be electable.
Yeah.
But what about President Obama? Is he in the back of his mind in a lot of this?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about it in the book.
I mean, the folks in this room know this because you've dealt with so many politicians over the years. Some of you are politicians, or have been ones in the past. So much of politics, even at the highest levels, is so damn personal. And they don't forget who was with them, who was against them. What's the old saying about Bush 41? With Bush before Iowa, and of course that meant Iowa 1980, by the way, not 1988, but WBBI for the damn 80 caucuses. And that's certainly the case with Biden, perhaps more than the average politician, because he's been around so long and he sort of knows who's been there over the years. He claims to have, what's it called, Irish amnesia.
Everybody but the grudges.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the truth is that Biden felt like he was treated as kind of an embarrassment by a lot of the people in the Obama White House, and that he wasn't really taken seriously. He was kind of the crazy uncle that they rolled their eyes at, and that when it came time in 2015 to pick Obama's successor, he was passed over for Hillary Clinton. And you're damn right that he's never forgotten that. In 2019 and 2020, David Axelrod, for his podcast, The Axe Files, interviewed every Democratic candidate for president with one exception during that campaign. The one exception was Joe Biden, right? Because there was no way in hell he was going to do the David Axelrod podcast after the treatment that Biden thinks he got from that crowd 5 years ago. So that tells you a lot about Biden. So yeah, that's a long way of saying when he's thinking about the sort of going big here and he's having this historians meeting and they're telling him that you can be sort of the next FDR, that create the next New Deal, he's absolutely thinking about what it means vis-a-vis he and Obama. We know that because we have it in the book, him telling an advisor in a very unguarded moment, quote, I don't think Barack is going to like one bit the coverage of me as more transformative than him. And by the way, Obama, similarly in this period, is thinking about Biden. And Obama is really frustrated at the coverage. He doesn't like the sort of spectacle of Biden with the cigarette holder as the next FDR. He can't stand that imagery. And so Obama is grumbling to his own people. This is bullshit because when I was president, there were 10 Joe Manchins in the Senate caucus. It was a lot different party back in 2009, and I couldn't do all this big stuff because of the sort of nature of Ben Nelson or Blanche Lincoln or whoever, right? And so there's kind of this shadow boxing between Obama and Biden going on, that still going on today. And between some of their staff that isn't that well known to the public because to their credit, they've cultivated this image of the sort of ebony and ivory type friendship, right? Unlikely, different generations, but they've come together. No, that's a political fairy tale, to borrow a New Hampshire phrase. And it's just not, it has no bearing in truth. I think they had a good enough relationship, but it wasn't anything like the kind of bromance that was sort of portrayed for their own purposes in the press. Where was that in New Hampshire, by the way, that Bill Clinton threw down the note cards and said that the Obama campaign was the biggest fairy tale he had ever seen? Hanover. Yeah, perfect, yeah. And of course Shoemaker knows it. We're perfect.
That's why he's an ambassador.
Exactly.
The,
Yeah.
who is the Jim Baker of the White House? You know, when we had Clinton, you know, James Carville, you had Bush, you had Karl Rove, even you just mentioned Axelrod. Who is it? The Donlin brothers? Is it his wife?
Look, there's a circle around Biden that he relies on implicitly, right? You named some of them, obviously, Ron Klain, Anita Dunn, Steve Ricchetti, in addition to, and Jen O'Malley Dillon, other folks we could name. It's a small circle. It is a question that we got actually at an event with David Axelrod about like where are the sort of like colorful staff profiles of the Biden White House, right? Like why don't you have the sort of like celebrity strategist of the Biden team? And they're just not culturally wired to operate that way, right? That in the campaign, it was sort of seen as being in poor form for members of the staff, including very senior members of the staff, to seek out or accept media attention. And I think it's, there are a lot of reasons why that seems like an appropriate and kind of like virtuous way to approach those jobs. I do think that it's another one of those things that's kind of denied the White House the sense of personality that some others have had that might help the public connect a little bit more with the administration, right? People love the James Carville thing. They just absolutely loved it. And it's not that there aren't colorful people around Joe Biden, it's just that you don't see them on television, and that's by design.
This has become a really hot topic on the right, who secretly is pulling the strings. Certainly Biden, and it's always disappointing when you say, well, no, actually it's Joe Biden himself and about a half dozen people that have been around him for quite a few years who are kind of doing this. You know, there isn't some sort of a Colonel House type figure that we don't know about, or to use a more recent reference, Dick Morris faxing in poll numbers. Terry, remember those days? To President Clinton. And sort of Alex's point, this is, I think, such an important reveal in speaking of books. If you think about every strategist, or even most strategists for winning presidential campaigns, they all got book deals eventually in recent history. Look, I think it's still possible that somebody from the Biden White House could get a book deal, but I don't know if it's going to happen, or if they'd even want it to. Like, would you know, Ron Klain or Steve Ricchetti want to do a book? I'm not sure. I think that tells you something about the cultural difference in this White House.
And in some respects, the generational difference in the White House, right?
Yep.
That he's the oldest president ever. His team is not quite of his generation, some of them pretty close, but they've been around him for a really long time. And they're not your sort of like hungry 42-year-old or whatever who wins a presidential campaign and then sets out to like make a fortune as fast as possible. Most of them have kind of made their fortunes already, if that's something that they want to do.
You mean like Corey Lewandowski? To borrow one New Hampshire example.
Nothing but respect for the people in New Hampshire.
Leaks seem to be very rare coming out of the White House. Do you find that?
We would like to think that this book shows otherwise.
Yeah, that's my softball question to you, Alex. You know?
No, I mean, I think that look, there's not a whole lot in the book, and there's not anything in the press about like President Biden throwing a bottle of ketchup against the wall in the White House, right? That's not the nature of leaking in like almost any White House except for just the one exception, right? But it used to be that it was considered a pretty valuable leak when you get like deep and unauthorized insight into the president's relationship with a co-equal branch of government, right? And I think that one of the things that we were up against in putting the book together, and that the political media is up against just in general, is that people's radar for what counts as like an eye-popping political story is so kind of out of whack after the Trump administration, right? Where like, no, like we don't have Biden calling up. We do have Trump calling up governors and sort of like menacing them in exchange for COVID aid or natural disaster relief and so forth, right? And like that stuff doesn't even count as like a top 20 Trump scandal, right? Because there's a whole lot of competition. But you know, look, I think that we found that our do you have the culture in the Biden White House that you had in the Trump White House, where like everybody leaves a meeting and then immediately calls up reporters to leak about their coworkers who they hate? No. But the president interacts with all kinds of people around the country and in Washington and around the world, and many of them are not nearly as discreet as the administration would like to project that they are.
Yeah, and we do have Biden watching cable TV in a similar fashion to President Trump. Not the same volume, but with the same concern about what's being said about him on television. There's this a fun scene in the book where sort of Biden in the mornings, at least, is very given to watching Morning Joe. And as you folks know in this room who watch Joe and Mika, one of the frequent characters on that show is Richard Haas, who's the longtime foreign policy hand who ran the Council on Foreign Relations. You know, only at St. A's could you say Richard Haas, and everybody nods in the room. This is my base here, man, I'll tell you. This is great. And so Richard Haas has been very critical of the Biden foreign policy for much of 21. And so Biden tells his staff, get Richard in here, and I want to talk to him about foreign policy. And the staff's like looking at their shoes for a little bit and looking up at the ceiling, and then says, sure you want to do it? And Biden's really sure he wants to get Haas into the White House. And sure enough, the Biden staff salutes, and they summon Richard Haas to the Oval Office for a frank and candid conversation about the Biden foreign policy to satisfy the boss's request. So there are some similarities, but no, this is a much more conventional White House with conventional staff members acting in conventional ways.
What impact will the January 6th committee have on the November elections?
Look, I think it has been useful for the very small percentage of Americans who have watched with somewhat open mind about those events. I tend to think it has solidified what a lot of sort of independent leading Democrats thought about those events and Trump's role in them in ways that I think are hurtful to his chances in 2024 if he is the nominee. And I think more broadly, it's given a permission to a lot of Republican voters who are not kind of the hardcore ultra MAGA, if you will, to kind of move on. They'll never say that. They'll never issue a sort of statement of regret that, yeah, actually it turns out Trump was kind of a bum and I was wrong all along. Like, that's never going to happen, right? I think what the 1-6 hearings do is by putting it out there in such vivid terms, it just creates more momentum for the counter-Republican that we've all met who says, love Trump, great president, love the policies, but he couldn't keep his mouth shut, or he's just kind of divisive, and I'm just not sure the country wants to go there again. I think for that kind of Republican, it just gives them more fodder to kind of move on to DeSantis or whoever the next flavor is.
Yeah, I think there's one other dynamic is one thing that happened during the Democratic primary last time that was really unusual by the standards of crowded primary campaigns, that Biden tended to do better when the spotlight was on somebody else. That when he was sort of the main character in the Democratic primary, he had a really, really hard time sort of sustaining interest and energy and momentum. But when everybody was focused on, Mike Bloomberg or Mayor Pete or Elizabeth Warren or whatever, like Biden would kind of tick up and hang out there in the high 20s, which is where he needed to be for a while. You haven't seen Biden's numbers bounce up during the January 6th hearings, but I do think it's been helpful to him and to Democrats generally that for so much of the last 2 months, maybe not the main news story in any given week, but like one of the 2 or 3 main news stories, and usually the main political news story has been the committee's investigation and sort of other related investigations, because it keeps the spotlight off of what would otherwise be day after day of, less so the last few weeks, but like, have you seen the prices at the gas station or at the supermarket? Day after day of where's the baby formula, right? Not heard so much about that lately. So I do think that's helpful in a sort of indirect way.
Mike Murphy, who I think folks in this room will know, called the 1-6 hearings a therapy animal for Democratic voters this summer, which I thought was a pretty vivid description.
Do you think that a significant number of Republicans want President Trump to be the voice, but not the nominee.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think there is a large group in the party who doesn't want Trump to go away. They just don't want him to be the nominee again. I think that, in fact, that could be perhaps the most pivotal voting bloc there is in the Republican primary, who is far from anti-Trump, but just wants somebody different to carry the torch going forward. And this is why it's important how a lot of these candidates run vis-a-vis Trump and why they're going to be careful, I think. Look, I think you'll have obviously a sort of hardcore anti-Trump candidate in the Republican primary itself, whether that's Larry Hogan or Liz Cheney or somebody else, but I think you're going to have other people who are much more nuanced about the former president, and sort of watching them try to appeal to both the sort of anti-Trump electorate and the kind of pro-Trump but not Trump as nominee electorate, I think it's going to be super revealing watching them.
You know, the system they have in a lot of other countries, I'm thinking particularly of European countries where they elect the government and the prime minister, and then separately you have the president, who's like a mostly ceremonial figure who's supposed to sort of embody the nation one way or another. In Britain, they have the Queen. I think a lot of Republicans would be delighted to have Donald Trump as like that kind of president, right? Like off here, like making your speech on Christmas Day or whatever. And meanwhile, we have like Prime Minister DeSantis actually operating the show in Washington. Like we don't have that system, and we don't have sort of a monarch role available for him. Although I think that's one that he would probably go for if it were offered.
I'm just trying to imagine Trump in his golf clothes, like fresh from the 18th hole, with like one of those old-time radio microphones at Mar-a-Lago for the Christmas Day address to his subjects. And speaking of Mar-a-Lago, we have to mention our trip there. You know, Alex and I interviewed the former president at his home in Mar-a-Lago in April 21, 3 months after he left the presidency. And it was so striking being down there because you immediately recognize that this is a very different former president than we've ever seen in this country, because it really felt like it's the sort of exiled leader plotting his return. And that was striking from the outset. But what's also revealing to us was we interviewed him at 4 p.m. in the afternoon in the sort of great room, the main area of his club for all to see. And we realized why it was timed that way and why we were where we were, because just after 5, as the interview conveniently was wrapping up, there was a flood of people coming into the club. And it became pretty obvious to us that Trump wanted to show us off to them to convey to his members that, hey, I'm still in demand here. And that Trump wanted to show the members off to Alex and I to demonstrate, look, I still got a lot of members in my club here. I'm not discredited at all here at Mar-a-Lago, and they're still coming to kiss the ring. That's what he wanted to convey. What we actually came away thinking about was, oh my gosh, Trump had nuclear codes a half an hour ago, and he's back to being a maitre d' now. Because I kid you not, Dave Carney over there, President Trump was telling folks about prime rib night. He was pushing shrimp cocktail on everybody. He was telling Martha her hair looks great. Have you lost weight, Don? You look fantastic, right? He's working the room. He's sort of doing his shtick. And you can tell, I mean, he's sort of back to being the hotelier that he was for so many years. And we were so struck by that. And literally, they're putting the sort of like buffet lines out, and the food is like being placed around us as we're finishing the interview, and we see him go to work there. And then I'll end with this. He offered for us to stay for dinner. As we were walking out, he said, well, stop, hold on, do you want to stay for dinner? And we got briefed on this because we knew other authors who had gone down, and they said, he's got his shtick. You'll do the interview, and at the end, as you're walking out, he'll stop you and say, do you want to stay for dinner? And so we knew it was kind of a set routine. And we also knew what he really meant. He didn't mean stay for dinner with me. What he means is go out on the deck and sit 30 feet across from me at a different table by yourself and watch me across the deck all night as I'm greeted in this kind of wedding-style receiving line at my table. And folks come kiss the ring. And thankfully, we had a sort of excuse at the ready for why we had to leave, because otherwise, I think we would have sat there and tried that prime rib on our dime, by the way, too.
You talk in your book an awful lot about Kevin McCarthy. And,
Never ends.
and you have him on tape, and just among us folks here, can you just tell us, well, you got the tape, but the tape obviously is damaging.
You know, at
Says private?
WMUR, I showed up today. I think
Huh?
you know, we could have revealed that, but
There you go.
WMUR didn't
There
show,
you-
so.
I mean, where he says privately he's going to ask the president to resign. Talk about that.
Good.
I mean, well, where to start? I think that one of the themes of the book that, in retrospect, I wish we had been more explicit about, but I think it comes through in the telling, is the enormous gap between what our political leaders say in private, including about each other, and what they say in public. I think it's more dramatic, obviously, on the Republican side, but boy, is it a major dynamic on the Democratic side, too, the gulf between the way the party really feels about the Biden administration at its own base and its activist class and the way they speak in public. And McCarthy has obviously become, I think appropriately, a kind of the poster child for this, right? That, you know, we spent 5, 6 years and counting writing about to the point that readers of the New York Times were just like exasperated with us, like, come on, this is all bullshit. Like, if Republicans really felt this way, they would say it in public. But, you know, just writing over and over about, like, you know, in private they actually hate the guy or can't stand him or think he's a barbarian, but, you know, in public they're scared to cross him or value what he's doing on policy. And, you know, now we finally have the tape to prove it, and not just with any given Republican, but with the guy who is the likeliest person, not by no means certain, but the likeliest person to be the next Speaker of the House. And it is somebody, after the tape came out, sort of made the comment on Twitter that, like, wouldn't it be funny if or wouldn't it be appropriate if the scandal that finally took down Kevin McCarthy was that he was wanted to do the right thing in private, right? As opposed to, like, privately he was plotting all this insane stuff. That, like, no, privately he wanted to do the right thing, and then publicly he didn't. Obviously did not take out Kevin McCarthy. That's not the goal of a revelation like that. We'll see if he pays a price over time. But I do think that after that tape, it's really hard it should be really hard for anybody to take at face value basically anything that Kevin McCarthy in particular, but the leadership class, the Republican Party in general, says about Donald Trump when the cameras are rolling and the microphones are on and they know it.
Yeah, no, he spoke for he spoke for his conference fittingly. I mean, that's the view of the bulk of Republican lawmakers in Congress, is that President Trump is sort of not somebody that they're proud to call their leader, but they bow to him because that's the preference of their voters. I think we're sort of 7 years running now. We're still living that story, you know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the Democrats seem now to be re-energized on the abortion issue. They feel they have an issue to run on, and they look at Kansas last night as proof. But don't the Democrats also have their problems with crime? We see that in a couple of the elections already. Crime seems to be prominent front and center, and some of the Democrats don't know how to handle that.
No, and Republicans have sort of weaponized the 2020 era calls to defund the police to exploit that issue. Alex mentioned the sort of theme that runs through our book about the sort of gap between what politicians say in public and what they say in private. And we have a series of memos that we obtained from Biden's chief pollster, John Anzalone, beginning in the spring of 2021, in which he's privately warning Biden and Biden's inner circle about a series of issues that could bite them politically: immigration, inflation, and crime. And you talk about prophetic. He saw that stuff early. That's why he's their pollster, and warned them about it. They didn't really act on it, in part because they were so focused on pushing through his agenda, and obviously they're sort of politically now paying a price on those issues.
Yeah, what about 24? We talked about somebody like DeSantis maybe looking at it.
Yeah.
Going forward, if the day, I think the presidential election really starts the day after the midterm.
Yeah.
And if the president makes a statement November, December, maybe early the following year, that he may not seek re-election. What do the Democrats do Do they look at governors? Do they look at mayors? Do they look at senators?
All the above.
I mean, I think the most revealing thing about the format of the question you just asked is that you didn't start with or mention the sitting vice president.
Right.
And I think that the biggest unspoken issue in Democratic politics used to be whether Biden's going to run again. It's very spoken now. I think somewhat less spoken is the issue of general lack of confidence in Vice President Harris as a substitute for him. And it's something that you hear at every level of the Democratic Party. It isn't just sort of, I think people who are supporters of Vice President Harris or real admirers of Vice President Harris would like to make this out to be just the sort of like insular, elite Democratic strategist world who like wants to muscle in the governor or senator of their choice. And like, it's just not. You talk to our rank and file Democratic voters, including voters who were supportive of President Biden in the last primary. And like, it's not that they dislike her, but I think there's a real lack of confidence in her as well as in the president himself. I think the outcome of the midterms matters a lot. That if Democrats hold the Senate, like break even in gov races or maybe lose one or two, and like lose the House but don't get totally obliterated in the House, I think Biden will probably have a little bit more time to decide what he wants to do. And I think the culture of deference that so dominates the Democratic Party at every level will probably control things for a little bit longer. If the midterms turn into a fiasco for Biden's party, I think you'll hear a whole lot of people saying what you heard a couple members of Congress from Minnesota say over the last week, Dean Phillips and Angie Craig, that it's time for new leadership at every level of the Democratic Party. Meaning not just the president, but the Speaker of the House, maybe the Senate. And if that happens, then it really does open the door for people, governors, senators, members of the House, perhaps mayors of small Indiana cities to get into the presidential race. Because if it does become a real sense of, not just this is a moment to try a new presidential candidate, but this is a moment to turn over the leadership of the Democratic Party writ large, I think it becomes much, much easier for people to get in without feeling like they're launching a personal attack on either Biden or Harris.
But the codependence between Biden and Trump cannot be overstated. Biden, obviously, in some ways depends on Trump running again as his rationale for why he should be the nominee. So to that end, a quick Trump announcement this fall or this winter could actually strengthen Biden's hand as well as a sort of better than expected midterm announcement.
But don't you think going back to the vice president, when they made the selection of Kamala Harris, they made it saying that she's been vetted, she's been tested. This brings us to victory in November. But nobody really thought, how are we going to govern her now once we win? What's her role?
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever read where they had that clearly defined. And then all of a sudden they say, give her the third rail, immigration, just run with it. It didn't seem like people were preparing her for success and a meaningful role. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right, and I think that one of the things we show in the book, right, is that there's a distrust and frustration on both sides of that relationship, right? That no, they didn't have a clear plan for her, and no, they didn't set her up for success. There's an interview, the two of them with Jake Tapper after the election, where Tapper asked, like, so is she going to have a portfolio similar to the one you had on the stimulus? Addressing the question to Biden, addressing the question to Harris, and Biden cuts in. And says, well, her portfolio is going to be like helping me on the most important issues, which, okay, that's pretty vague assignment, right? And I think the frustration on the other side of the relationship, I'm not saying Biden personally, although to some extent this is certainly true, is that like the vice president historically gets all kinds of crummy assignments. And the job of the vice president is to grab them with both hands and do the best that you can, and then privately complain all over town about how the president's such a jackass, right? And there's no part of that, in some ways to her credit, that Kamala Harris has engaged in, in the model of her predecessors, including Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. It's a long-standing Washington tradition that this job is sort of well, I won't use the actual quote from John Nance Garner, but you guys probably know the quote about the bucket of spit. And you know, look, I think part of the reason why it does stand out more now is because the vice president is a return to a more traditional model of vice presidents, which is the understudy, which we haven't had in the last 3 vice presidents, because we had VPs who were older and had more governing experience than the presidents, Cheney, Biden, and then Pence, which was kind of a break from that tradition. So I think because of that, it has created a bit more of a shock to have a president who you know, has more experience on the Hill and overseas.
I'm looking at the clock, so we're coming to an end. Maybe the last question is really, what do you want readers to learn from your book?
I think that one of the, I mean, we hope they learn a whole lot, but I think that one of the core themes of the book is that the American political system is bigger and more complicated than the presidency. Yeah. And one of the, I mean, you all know this, but that one of the conventions of political reporting that can be so constraining in the day-to-day coverage of news is treating the president as the main character and everybody else as secondary at best, and treating Washington as the center of the universe, when in fact, like, the country is quite deliberately structured for those things not to be the case. And so one of the things that we did when we set out to write this thing was to try to tell the story of the political system as a whole. It's not a book about Donald Trump. It's not a book about Joe Biden. It's not even a book about Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It's a book about American politics in this period. And you were going to learn the names of House members you didn't know before. Maybe not you, but many readers will learn the names of House members they didn't know before. You're going to see the role that governors and mayors play in moments of crisis like COVID and like the contested election. And hopefully, if we've done our jobs well, you're going to see how it all fits together, or doesn't, in a more integrated way than the sort of great man of history or not so great man of history version of political storytelling that you usually get.
It's hard to top that, but I'll just say we're going to stick around and sign a few copies of the book. So if you want to get your copy signed, we're going to do that. And please spread the word about this book to your friends and fellow political junkies. And I think the way I would capture it, if you're telling people that, is the last couple of years were confusing, chaotic, and tumultuous in American politics. And if you're curious to what the heck happened, I think we make some sense of the last couple of years, all in one place in the pages of this book. So thank you all for having us.
With
very
that,
much. Appreciate it.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was going to ask.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I was going to ask you about Rich Lowry.